Hello and welcome to this UCL Lunch Hour lecture on the Library of Lost Maps. My name is Dr. Catherine Parker, Cartographic Collections Manager at the Royal Geographical Society. It is my honor and distinct pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor James Cheshire. James Cheshire is Britain's only Professor of Geographic Information and Cartography. He's the inaugural director of the UCL Social Data Institute and is a world-leading mapmaker. His cartographic creations have been enjoyed by millions and possibly by some of you listening today. He's an elected Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences and has been recognized with many prestigious awards, including from the likes of us at the RGS and the British Cartographic Society. His co-authored book, Atlas of the Invisible, won the American Association of Geographers Globe Award. Before we begin, I want to let you know that we will have some time at the end of the lecture for questions, and these can be submitted at any point during the talk by going to Slido, that's sli.do, on your web browser, and entering the event code, which is #maps. I will now hand over to James for the talk.
Great. Thank you so much for that kind of introduction and for taking the time actually to join us, everyone, for your lunch hour. And so today I want to talk about the Library of Lost Maps. So I'll just share my presentation with you. And so this is a talk really that shares with you some of the stories and some of the maps that I have discovered in the UCL Department of Geography's map library. Now, the map library itself was a room that was quite common to geography departments across the country. So in their heyday, every geography department would have a map collection, and it would be filled with a room filled with drawers that would have maps associated with the topics that the departments are interested in, places that field work would be taking place in, areas where academics would be researching, and so on. And then students would come into these places and they would be required to study the maps for their coursework and so on. Now, since the start of the 21st century, really, since the year 2000 or so, many of these map collections have fallen into decline. And the reasons for that are fairly straightforward. It's because maps nowadays are predominantly digital, and so the need for a paper map has definitely kind of declined as more and more people rely on the digital data that they use for not just navigating, on their phones, but kind of in research and academic activities as well. And so this is a fairly common sight, actually, within map collections that still exist in the UK, and I have a map of map collections in a second, which I'll show you. But essentially, they're kind of often seen as rooms that are full of redundant technology. Sometimes they were once repurposed for computer rooms and computer labs, and then when the computer technology wasn't even updated so much, because the idea of sort of big cluster rooms, that's less important now as well. The rooms became storage areas and kind of started to look a little bit down at heel. Now, the fantastic thing about the UCL map library is actually it's a survivor. And in its heyday, it was one of the biggest map collections in a university in the country. And today, it's one of the few that actually remains intact. So by that, I mean it's the room as it was originally designed, full of the maps as they were originally intended. And this is a rare thing. So many map collections across the UK, as this map shows, have either been disposed of, so the map's literally thrown away or given away. Some have been kind of broken up and put into their institutional libraries rather than a departmental collection, or remnants of them still in institutional libraries. And others have kind of got an uncertain fate. So at UCL, we're incredibly lucky because we have this room that is very much as it was when it was in its prime, I guess, as a resource for the department. And as many of the other collections have disappeared, the value of what we hold has only increased because we understand kind of what we have well, to a large extent. We now understand what we have, but we understand that also with other collections going away, we have copies of maps and things that might otherwise have been disposed of. So the geography department's map library has kind of had a very small amount of use, maybe 2 or 3 days a year. Students might go in there, be introduced to the space. And the future of it was still uncertain. There was still we're still unsure what the future holds for the space. And so I wanted to get to know what we had and actually try and inspire a greater use of the collection. And so just immediately after COVID, I started to use the space for my cartography and data visualization classes. And the reason for that was an emeritus professor suggested to me that I might have a look at the collection and see what was there, because I kind of was dimly aware that we had a map library and that the space existed, but I didn't actually properly go in there and look at it and see what was in the drawers. And so on some initial trips down there, I discovered just what extraordinary maps we had, some of the earliest examples of different types of data visualization, for example. And that was something that I wanted to use to inspire my students. And so coming into a space like that, handling the physical paper maps was a really kind of energizing experience for me, and something that kind of made me think, well, there's actually something quite special here. How much do we know about it? Is there more that we can do with this collection? So this picture, I think, was taken in January 2022. And since then, really, I've been working through the collection to see what we had. And I've been researching the maps, and some of the stories I've told form this book called The Library of Lost Maps. And so it's been a real pleasure for me to get to know Anne Oxenham, who's photographed here. Now, Anne, she has an extraordinary contribution to UCL. She staffed the room from 1961 to 2001 when she retired. And I actually invited her back to tell us all the secrets, really, of how the room worked, and the bit of the history of the room and what it was like to work in UCL over that period. With colleagues, we worked to sort of photograph the wall charts that we have. So we have a big collection of these pull down charts that we used in teaching. I was able to kind of do some imaging and so on, just to start digitizing the collection. And then in the bottom right of the slide actually is a picture of the Atlas collection, where we have something like 750 atlases, a large proportion of which actually are not found in other collections. Even the likes of the Bodleian didn't have many of the atlases that we have. So it's an extraordinary collection. It's an extraordinary resource. And, the reason for this status of such a special place is because actually it's part of UCL, and UCL has a very rich history of mapping and cartography. So as many of you will know, UCL was founded in 1826 as part of a kind of broad sweep of educational initiatives that were happening around Bloomsbury. And it has a unique position in that it was the first university to appoint a professor in geography, someone by the surname McConaughey. He was in post only 3 years, but it still kind of indicated that geography was an important discipline, one where a professor was warranted. McConaughey himself was also founders of the likes of the Royal Geographical Society, where Katie now works. In addition to his appointment, actually, UCL took the founders of UCL took an active interest in sharing geographical knowledge. And they were doing that through this organization that was created at the time with the fantastic name, the Society for the Diffusion of Useful Knowledge, or SDUK. And SDUK had a range of different publications. The one I'm showing here is a penny magazine, but they did a penny encyclopedia, and a number of other book publications that came out of the SDUK. And in fact, the archive of the SDUK is actually held in the UCL Special Collections. And so actually I've been able to look through that archive as well to understand what's going on. And I'll show you some images from that in a second. The reason I'm showing you this page of Penny Magazine is because it has a map seller on the front of it. But unfortunately, as the SDUK would argue, is it was a German map seller. And they were making the case that in the first half of the 19th century, so we're talking sort of 1820s, 30s, and 40s, they were bemoaning the lack of geographic education amongst the broad population in Britain. And they were arguing that if the British were better educated in geography, then there would be a market for maps, and therefore we would see map sellers as a more common sight, and as they were appearing in Germany. So SDUK reasoned that maps were an important window into the world, and it was maps that were used to support the articles that they might be writing, not just about geography, but about history as well. And so, in fact, the first map that the SDUK published was of ancient Greece. Now, they actually didn't just publish one map, they published an entire atlas, and they did it through a subscription model. And I'll talk about that in a second, but essentially, it was this kind of thick atlas of loose sheets. And I knew that such a thing existed, but I was really surprised to discover it at the back of a cupboard in the Atlas collection in the map library. And so this photo here is how it kind of emerged, covered in sort of brown, creased brown paper. And I wasn't terribly optimistic when I first caught sight of it. The first two maps on the top of the pile were of the Eastern, the Western Hemisphere. And you can see here they're pretty grubby because they've endured kind of a century and a half, nearly 2 centuries of kind of London grime being sat on the shelf, but still they can be made out. It's clear what the maps were. As I went down the pile, the maps got cleaner and brighter, and so we've got some fantastic examples here. And so, as I mentioned, these maps were not sold as a single bound atlas. They were sold as part of a subscription. So people would pay a small amount of money every month or so, and they would receive copies of maps when they were ready. And so this led to a slightly kind of interesting kind of combination of maps appearing for people that wasn't terribly logical and slightly frustrating for them. So the map wrappers I'm showing here, so this is how they arrived. In this case, there's a pairing of maps here. One is of the world's rivers, the other is of northern Scotland. And so it might be months or even years before the subscribers got copies of southern Scotland appearing. And so they weren't able to complete their collection. And this led to some complaints, actually. A number of subscribers even complained that they might be dead before they were able to complete the atlas, because in the end it was nearly 2 decades before the atlas was finished. SDUK became probably one of the most successful atlases to be printed, certainly in the first half of the century, if not throughout the kind of whole Victorian period as well. And they printed something like 3 million maps, which is an absolutely extraordinary total. And their famous probably most famous for a couple of the maps I'm showing here. So the one on the right is a map of rivers that are emanating from a kind of invisible North Pole, if you will. They're all sort of, or an invisible pole that they're flowing outwards from, so you can understand the comparative lengths of the world's rivers. And on the left of your screen is a map of Venice, which forms part of a series of city maps that SD UK published, that were some of the finest of the era. And actually, at a really interesting time in terms of the industrialization of cities. Many of the cities they have are still within the original city walls before the kind of expansion that took place in their populations. And the reason they were so successful, and indeed they led a life after SD UK that I'll share in a second, is because they were the SD UK were really committed to quality and ensuring that the maps were as good as they could possibly be. And they were printed in large numbers. And so they invested in steel printing plates that were much harder to kind of etch and engrave, but they enabled these large print runs to happen, and they enabled finer detail than you would otherwise get on, say, a copper printing plate. And as I mentioned, UCL Special Collections have the archives of SD UK, and they have a book that contains the minutes of the map committee. So these were the people who were working on the maps over this long period. And so it's really nice to see kind of the discussions as they happen. And with all kind of long-term projects like this, you need sort of someone who's energized to keep things going. And the person who fulfilled that role was someone called Francis Beaufort. Now, if you're a sailor, you may be familiar with Beaufort because he is famous for the Beaufort scale that shows wind strength. But as a part of the British Admiralty, he had really good access to maps and the latest data. And he would get up at 5 or 6 in the morning, work on these maps almost as a hobby, and then go about his kind of day job. And his enthusiasm and his perfectionism, I think, is why the project was so successful. But at times, I suspect even his patience was wearing thin as sort of members of the committee came and went. And one of my favorite minutes is I'm showing on this screen. It's impossible to read because it's so faded here. But if we zoom in, we might just be able to make out that it says, the committee was summoned for this day, but Captain Beaufort alone attended. And so this was in 1831. Basically, Beaufort was the only one to show up to this particular meeting above a pub in Farringdon, where they used to meet, because, and the funny thing, what makes me laugh about this as well, is actually I think he had to write the minutes as well. I don't think the secretary even showed up. And so he was a perfectionist, and he did have the latest data available. But of course, given the period we're looking at, as I say, it's the 1820s and 30s and 40s, many of these maps were not detailed by any stretch. They weren't filled in, and nor were they kind of obviously truly representative of life on the ground, reflecting in particular sort of some of the colonial priorities of the time and where explorations and expeditions had happened. So look carefully at these maps and you'll see there are labels for things, particularly on the continent of Africa, of herds of gazelles, high acacia trees, herds of elephants and so on, being used to kind of fill out what would otherwise be blanks on the map. And in researching SD UK, it kind of gave me a real sense of how maps were produced and the amount of effort that went into their production, but also understanding that sometimes the map as it was presented to the printer was actually far from the finished product in terms of its visual appearance. And so this is a nice example of that. So here's the final map as printed by SD UK. It shows Germany and Switzerland. If we look at Beaufort's notes, so this is from another archive, we can see, again, you don't need to see the detail on this, but there's a lot of red. Anything that's red is stuff that Beaufort himself has added to this draft. And so he put all the terrain in. You can see the concentration of the red sort of in the bottom half, which is where the Alps are. But there's also huge amounts of detail in the red caption here reads, "Make this road a single line as far as Mulhausen." And so he was adding these last minute notes to the engraver, who would then kind of action them. And so as the final draft of a map, it looks nothing like the finished product, because so much of the work in terms of creating kind of these crisp, definitive outlines that we're used to seeing on maps was done by the engraver at the last stage. And then in this era, any additional color that was added was done so through hand watercolorists who were kind of tracing out borders. And so I mentioned that SD UK actually had a life beyond UCL. So they wrapped up in about 1850. The maps continued to be profitable, but the rest of the SD UK publications were not making money. And so they decided that the organization kind of served its purpose, and they wrapped up. Because of these, the quality of the printing plates and the reputation and esteem in which the maps were held, they were sold on to other map publishers, most notably Edward Stanford Limited, who are still going, the Stanford's bookshop in Covent Garden, who repurposed the plates and used them for an atlas that he created. And they were still being used up until the start of the 20th century. And they crop up in some extraordinary places. So I did a visit to the Library of Congress, and I saw a globe there. And I was sort of shocked to see that on the globe was reference to the Society for the Diffusion of Useful Knowledge. And in that photograph was Teddy Roosevelt sat beside this globe. And this, in fact, was a globe that he had in his office at the turn of the century. And what's interesting about the date on the globe is it's 1882, which is obviously 30 odd years after SD UK finished or ceased to exist. But it was still being used as a brand of kind of quality and good mapping by this particular company, Malby Globes. And so it's an extraordinary thought, anyway, for me, that this project founded in Bloomsbury, designed to sort of educate the masses about the importance of maps and geography, actually, were seated in the office of one of the most historic figures of the 19th, or predominantly 20th century, a whole kind of ocean away. And there were many of these kind of interesting kind of founders and people at UCL who were or associated with UCL who were doing, important cartographic work. And a few of their maps crop up in the map library as well. So this is a really stunning map of what is today's northern Italy. It was published in 1810. And what struck me about this was actually it was covered, every individual map sheet had this stamp on it, which is the stamp that Katie will be very familiar with because it's the one that she has in her archives, which is that of the Royal Geographical Society. And so this obviously intrigued me. Why is it we have got RGS maps in the map library? And crucially, who did they belong to? So we can discern a bit more about that from the sort of different color plates, the sort of the different name plates that are on the map. And we can see that with every single one, they had the same name, which is this GB Greenough. And it stands for George Bellis Greenough. So he was a kind of gentleman scholar in the sort of most purest sense, in a way. He inherited vast fortune from his grandfather, who ran sort of a pharmaceutical empire with quack cures and all sorts of other quack cures and all sorts of other things. And so when his grandfather died, Greenough inherited this money, all this money, and he never had to work a day in his life. But instead, he threw himself into the scientific establishment. He was an early backer of UCL and was involved in some UCL committees. He was part of the MAP committee for SD UK. And he was a founder of the Geological Society. He donated his rock collection to UCL. And so the Department of Geology still has Greenough's collection of rocks and fossils. and we'll talk more about those in a second. But these maps were maps that he had in fact donated to the Royal Geographical Society upon his death. And we can see that in the register of maps that came into the society. There's a bit of a clue about how we may have ended up with them at UCL, because it says here that there were 2 copies donated, and the theory is that effectively there may have been a prioritization at some point in the last 150 odd years, that the RGS wanted to keep pristine copies of maps rather than those that were kind of damaged or marked in some way. And Greenough was someone who would annotate his maps in detail. So this particular map actually is covered in pencil marks for different parts of a trip that he actually took across northern Italy. And we can see, if we zoom in, he mentions, for example, this Colossus of San Carlo Borromeo, which was completed in 1698. So it was well before Greenough even arrived. It's visible from Lake Maggiore, and Greenough may well have seen it from a boat trip that he took in 1828. Now, the reason I know he took a boat trip and he visited these places is because his archives, a lot of his papers, are also in UCL Special Collections, and he has a number of notebooks that detail his trip. And so I was able just to follow his progress along the map thanks to these notebooks. And what comes out is an impression of a man who was obsessed with detail, of collecting facts and information, interested in travel and interested in the world around him. Given his associations with intellects in London at the time, including the likes of Darwin and people like that, and given how influential he was, he's not super well known today. And that's in part because he published very little in his life. And what he really is best known for is this map, which is one of the first geological maps of England and Wales. It was first published around 1820, and then there was a subsequent edition about 20 years later. And he's famed for his geological map, and in particular his relationship with William Smith, who created the first geological map of England and Wales. And there's kind of a narrative about those 2 men falling out, and Greenough being the establishment figure, whereas Smith was very much sort of the underdog in the quest for the first geological map. It's quite a complex story, but again, it's all in the letters and the archives in UCL Special Collections. But nonetheless, Greenough was committed to kind of direct observation, particularly in the first maps he made of England and Wales, and this gathering of data. And whilst he was keen on things like directly observing things, he himself didn't have to see them. What he did was he ran an enormous network of correspondence. And to my complete surprise and delight, I actually discovered the second kind of geological map that he produced, which was of the Indian subcontinent. It's a vast map in multiple sheets. I found it in the India drawer, and it's not in great shape, but actually it's one of only sort of 33 copies that were known to exist, or I should rather say only 33 copies were known to exist, and this is one more that we can now add to that list. And so Greenough completed this map without ever having visited the Indian subcontinent. He did so through correspondence of various colonial parties that were stationed there, and he imagined sort of selling this map to the East India Company, who bought a few copies, but it was actually published the year Greenough died, and so he wasn't able to kind of energize the sales in the same way, and there were kind of various other interests that were out there to kind of prevent him from his map becoming successful, which I won't share today. But it's a fascinating example, really, of the way that science was conducted and the way that maps became an important part of that. And so SDUK, George Greenough, these characters, with hindsight, were well connected to UCL. And so, of course, it may not be surprising that we found some of their maps, or I found some of their maps in our map library. But there are many other maps as well, and they come from kind of interesting and surprising places, perhaps. And I set about trying to work out, how the room itself came to be. Why is it that we have this map library? How did it become one of the largest, and so on? And so there's a key point in kind of the history of UCL, which is the post-war period. So after the Blitz, the Second World War, much of UCL was damaged, and so that there was a period of renewal. And as part of this period of renewal, the head of department at the time, by the name of Fawcett, he made the case that the geography department needed a map library. And this is him making the case. But my favorite thing about this note is he says, despite, you imagine sort of UCL being bombed out, but he's requesting that a ceiling of a lecture theatre be raised at least 6 feet, but adjacent to which someone has written "how?" ? It doesn't strike me as a priority of the time, but in addition to that, he's asking for a map store and workroom for a technical assistant and space for students to use maps. And so we know that it was him, probably 1945, 46, that started making the case for a map room. And we know too kind of what maps he purchased. And because I found the ledger that contains the sales of the purchases of the maps he requested from the likes of Edward Stanford and so on. And we know that academics at UCL had particular links to the military and therefore would have collected maps over the course of their duties, or at least created maps too. So here are a couple of maps that were used in the Paris Peace Conference at the end of the First World War. They're ethnographic maps of Hungary. And the right-hand one, the slightly more complex one, was part of a naval intelligence handbook that UCL academics had a hand in creating. They created, lots of geographers at the time were engaged in the creation of these kind of intelligence briefings around the Paris Peace Conference and so on. So this is from the manual of Alsace-Lorraine that we have. It's the region without any borders on it. I find it fascinating because obviously it's the region that they're then using to it's a sort of map that is a blank canvas of just the terrain that then the politicians would then start to kind of sketch borders onto. And as I say, it was quite common for geographers at the end of the First World War, if they weren't directly engaged in military service, they would have, it's kind of on the battlefield, they would have been engaged in these intelligence roles. But there are mysteries as well. So we have this absolutely stunning illustrated map of China from 1931. It's huge. It's canvas. It's designed for use in schools. I doubt it was purchased. It may well have been donated by passing dignitaries or academics. And so we may never know where all of the maps in the collection have come from. But we can say for sure that the Second World War casts a really kind of long shadow over the room. And this is something that isn't terribly well known. And when I mentioned before about the kind of loss of map libraries across the country, many of these map libraries would be able to tell the same story as the one I'm about to tell, but without people appreciating kind of the history of the maps that they contained, and therefore, what we stand to lose. So I'm showing you a tourist map of Madrid. It was published originally by the German guidebook Baedeker, and it's dated to sort of the end of the end of the 1920s, early 1930s. When I looked more carefully, though, I thought this is an interesting map because actually around the edge of it, we have kind of all these details and grid references for things that you wouldn't ordinarily expect to see in a guidebook, nor would you see kind of a sheet map in this way in the guidebook. And then I spotted what was in the top left-hand corner, and that's the unmistakable stamp of the swastika, which was used to kind of demark any maps that had been, stored in 1930s, early 1940s Germany. And we can see at the bottom of the map that it actually arrived in the Office for the General Staff map room, so that's the British military, on the 4th of August 1945. And so what I'm looking at here and what I'm sharing with you is what in North America they call capture maps. And these were maps that were seized at the end of the Second World War by the Allies. They were kind of hoovered up as they swept across Europe. They came back to London, and then no one quite knew what to do with them because there were vast, vast quantities of these, literally tons and tons and tons of maps. And so map libraries, much like UCL's being the kind of case in point, were desperate for maps, and therefore they were all too happy to receive maps that were that had come from the war. And indeed, we have large numbers of these that span sort of atlases from 1930s Germany to highly classified at the time manuals that were created by the Nazis for pretty much every country they were either engaged in militarily or they were interested in working with. So on the table of the map library here, I'm showing some of these kind of manuals and invasion plans that were published that we have that we had just on the shelves in our map library. And as I say, other university map libraries would have had these, and accounting for different regions, because each department would have selected maps that were of regions particularly of interest to them. And so nationally, at one stage, we may have been able to create sort of multiple complete sets of these manuals. Now, with the disposals that have taken place, it's quite hard to do that. And so a vast quantity, by weight, I suppose, of maps have come from the Second World War, and ongoing kind of MOD disposals as well that happened throughout the 20th century. Any kind of duplicate maps and so on were donated to map libraries like ours. But there are plenty of things that you'd expect to find, particularly for the second half of the 20th century as well. So, I mentioned the 700 or so atlases that we have that span everything from the kind of 1920s Times atlases right up to atlases from the mid-90s. We have maps that show topics that geographers are typically interested in, such as inequalities. And this is one of the first maps to be first collection of maps really that shows a truly global distribution of diseases, and early maps and studies in diets and deficiency diseases, particularly focused on the global south. This was published in the early 1950s. And maps too that kind of reflect the interests of academics in the department. So UCL had a very strong interest in the USSR, in the Balkans, in Eastern Europe in general. And so actually we've got some of the finest Soviet atlases published, and indeed a very healthy collection of Soviet maps as well, including many, many wall charts that were donated or sort of handed to us from UCL, CEAS, and actually the Department of History as well in the mid-70s. So we didn't dispose of any of these, and so we still have them. This is a fantastically complex and intricate economic map of Romania. In most kind of departments, we could say, well, we might leave it there. We might say, well, we'll continue to sort of think about kind of traditional mapping. But actually at UCL, from the 60s onwards, whilst it kind of had a thriving map library, it was also pioneering some of the first electronic mapping. And of course, this digital age, was the death knell really ultimately for the map library. But we can still kind of see that the early digital maps, of course, had to be printed. And so we have a huge collection of these pioneering digital maps. So this was a map of the Birmingham region that was created. It was a collaboration. One of the collaborators is someone called Peter Wood, who is still an emeritus professor in our department, creating one of the first kind of electronically produced atlases of the Birmingham region. He supervised a former RAF pilot named Roger Tomlinson, who actually created the first ever, or completed, I should say, the first ever PhD in this thing called Geographic Information Systems, which is the kind of fundamental technology that powers every kind of digital map that we take for granted today. And that established kind of UCL and actually the wider Bloomsbury area as an important center for innovation in digital mapping that even kind of comes up to the present day. So colleagues I still work with, in particular Paul Longley and Maurizio Gibbin, who created this website called London Profiler, which is one of the first digital maps of London to show kind of thematic data about the population. And perhaps most impactfully, UCL was one of the kind of first institutions to support OpenStreetMap. So OpenStreetMap was a volunteered, or still is a volunteered kind of global mapping effort founded by a UCL computer science graduate named Steve Coast. This web platform was hosted on UCL servers and has developed today into probably one of the most important bits of spatial data infrastructure that we all use every day, and in ways that you wouldn't even imagine. So we have a real kind of legacy to be proud of here at UCL, and I always find it extraordinary how these things come back to the map library in some way. And so this is the world that we occupy today. So maps today have things like charging stations and amusement arcades and dog parks on, and sitting behind them is computer code rather than kind of hand drafted stuff that was done in sort of plotting rules and so on. So in the pink text here is the data that sits behind a point of interest in Bloomsbury, and it's the Lord John Russell pub. So that pub, this is how it's kind of digitally encoded on a map. And so even just thinking through kind of the history of cartography and mapping, I find it extraordinary how it does come alive just by sort of going through some of these maps in the collection. So I just wanted to end really by reading just the final sort of few paragraphs from the book, and then I'd be really excited to answer any questions you may have. So at the end of the book, I say, there are many stories I've been unable to tell, not least because many maps remained elusive in their purpose, in their history, and in the impact they had on the world. With more time, I'm sure some will reveal themselves, and that is why I'm committed to their preservation, for fear we might lose something special. I mourn the loss of map libraries that are no longer with us. As I look back at my own finds, I'm reminded by the weight of their history such as the ideas of 1820s Bloomsbury that led to the founding of UCL and the establishment of the structures of science we recognize today, or the early cartographic innovations that helped define how countries saw themselves. But I'm even more excited about the innovations of today, which, though they may be technologically unrecognizable from the hand-drafted maps that dominate the map library, nonetheless remain anchored to them through the fundamental problem of how best to capture the complexities of Earth in a single image. So thanks everyone for your attention, and this QR code will take you to the Slido that Catherine alerted you at the beginning. But otherwise, yeah, I guess we flip over to the Q&A.
Great. Thank you so much, James. That was absolutely fascinating. And now we have questions cascading in. I'm going to use or abuse, if you would like, my prerogative as chair, just to ask about kind of the nitty-gritty of working with this collection. How is it cataloged, if at all, and to whom is it available?
That's a very interesting question. So the cataloging system was kind of largely an Oxenham invention. So Anne had her own. It wasn't. It was based loosely on sort of the Parsons system. For those in the know, that's one of the ones of map cataloging. But Anne ran everything off kind of little index cards that had the paper reference, and then you'd go and find whichever drawer they're in, and so on. Unfortunately, we haven't digitized that catalog, and indeed, much of what I've discovered was not cataloged. And so, one of the key things we really need to do is get a catalog. So the atlases are cataloged, and the wall charts we have are pretty much cataloged. But the maps themselves, I couldn't tell you how many there were, but it's tens, if not hundreds of thousands. So that's something we need to get a grasp on. In terms of gaining access, unfortunately, at the present time, we're not really in a position to kind of broaden out access to the space in a way that I would like. And so that's something I'm working on, making a case, particularly within UCL, to see if we can get some dedicated resource to help to kind of celebrate what we have and to make it more accessible. So colleagues within the department can kind of, have been able to access it, and some use it occasionally for teaching. But in terms of a kind of a broader thing, I think, there's a lot of potential, but I haven't yet been able to solve the problem of how we might properly resource it.
Definitely, that's a problem across map libraries for sure. Adam has put up a couple of related questions about is it planned to retain the map library in its current form? So how kind of endangered is it? But also, are there any plans to maybe have an exhibition of some of these maps, or kind of a different format of accessing them, perhaps besides your wonderful book?
Thanks. So the so the catalyst for embarking on the project was the prospect that the room would not exist because of movements within the geography department to another. The geography department is currently split across two buildings, and there's always been an aspiration that one of the Bedford Way building those colleagues move in with the others in Northwest Wing. So that was the catalyst to work out what we had and to see if we were to move out, what would be saved and how much space it would take and all that kind of stuff. The situation we find ourselves in is that I don't, I think the prospect of that has ebbed away. So the room may itself, I don't believe that there's any kind of immediate plans for the room to disappear. But staffing is now a bit more of a challenge, particularly around certain professional services restructures that have been happening. So I can't give a straight answer on that question, unfortunately, much as I'd like to. In terms of broadening out access, yes, I'm hopeful that we will. I've got a very small amount of funding to try and integrate some of the maps, particularly the SD UK ones, into the UCL 200 celebrations, and I'm working on seeing where we can exhibit some of those, because I think they're an important part of the institution's history. And I'd love to get things digitized and so on. So the maps that are in the book are available on the book's website, but beyond that, I'm working on trying to get them more widely seen for sure.
Excellent. And someone brought up the UCL 200 initiative as a way to perhaps, get that cataloging done, but also get these things more seen. A couple of related questions about the kind of relationship between these physical maps and GIS. So Nicholas asks, how do you think the organization of physical maps in a physical space, such as a library, shaped the organization of knowledge in terms of digital geographic knowledge in GIS?
That's a great question. So there are direct lineages into that for sure. So certainly, the idea of the way the world can be kind of sectioned up into different regions, and those regions can kind of be used to access certain data sets and things. That's one thing. I think that the most direct analogy, and this comes through if you look at Tomlinson's thesis and so on, as well, is the idea that you layer up different information. So the way that you would do that analog is you'd have a light table with sheets of tracing paper and other bits on it that could then be layered up and to create a kind of a composite image of different data layers. That's essentially what, the foundational ideas of GIS and the power of kind of GIS is today. It's the fact that you can do that digitally and have those layers interact with each other. And the other thing to note is that most digital maps can trace their lineage right back to the paper maps, because it was paper maps that were digitized to create the first digital maps. So ordnance survey maps, for example. Of course, the data are always updated, but the first digital ordnance survey maps were directly digitized from paper versions.
And then continuing on from that, how will GIS being so ubiquitous in our daily lives now affect future preservation of these, well, I mean, documents, but now kind of data?
Yeah, that's another really good question, because what's so fantastic about the paper maps, and indeed the production of the paper maps, if you have the archive, is that actually everything's kind of as it was. You pull the map out the drawer and it's exactly as it was. It might be a bit grubby, but it's exactly kind of as it was when it was produced. And if you have, in some cases, you might have an archive, such as I did with the Greenough example, where you can actually then go back and see what some of the thought processes were that then contribute to the final version. With digital mapping, and I think about the digital maps I make every day, I'm not keeping an archive of anything that I'm doing. I'm just overwriting stuff and producing a final version of something. And there aren't really many ways at the moment of capturing how most digital maps are created. So I think a lot of that process is being lost because
Hmm.
we're not archiving it. And it's a challenging problem, and I don't have an immediate solution to it, particularly because we've got paper maps that are 300 years old. I've found they're going to be around for another few hundred years, I suspect, if they're looked after. Whereas we all know that digital technology becomes redundant and hard to store for so on. So even stuff that I've archived on a hard disk today, how am I going to be sure that it's going to be accessible 50, 100, even 200
Hmm.
years from now?
Definitely. On the idea of the older maps, what is the oldest map in the collection? And then what is your favorite or most unusual map in the collection?
Um, so our oldest one is, I think it's the seat of the Spanish War in Europe, and I think it's from 1670 something. I'm not quite sure where it came from, but it's been oddly kind of mounted on like almost like an early sticky back plasticky type stuff. So
Hmm.
it's definitely something that came in. It's not been at UCL that long. I mean, UCL's obviously not been around that long, but it's kind of, I suspect
Hmm.
someone picked it up somewhere probably in the last 50 years, and that's how we have it. Um, my favorite, I think my favorite maps or the favorite stories are the we. I don't have an answer to why we have them, but we have a really complete collection of ocean floor maps that were produced by someone called Marie Tharp and a collaborator called Bruce Heason, and getting to know how they were produced and kind of the chronology of how cartography then supported geological theories around plate tectonics and that kind of stuff. That I found really fascinating, and also how they communicated that to a wide public as well. So piecing all that together, has been probably one of the most gratifying stories I've been able to tell.
No, and we're very excited about that Marie Tharp story getting more publicity as well, because it is a fascinating one. Have you come across, I know we certainly have in our collection, any deliberately faked maps?
I don't, well, not knowingly, I guess. We've got maps that have mistakes on, and I suppose, there's famous examples of like the mountains of Kong kind of moving across Africa and so on, and then eventually disappearing. And so we've got some of those, and there's an interesting within the SDUK meeting minutes and other bits and pieces, there's some interesting discussions about map copyright.
Mhm.
So Beaufort copying other people's maps and other bits and pieces, and in fact, threats of legal action from other map publishers and things like that. And that's a fascinating thing for me, because anything that's fake or incorrect, gets copied across, and it's sort of an indicator sometimes of that the copying's happened. But I've not, to my disappointment, because I was hoping to find some interesting examples. To my disappointment, I haven't found anything that's obviously faked.
I think having worked around maps, I think that it's exaggerated the degree to which there are a lot of faked maps. But on the question of copyright, of course, Isabella Alexander's work is really interesting on that, about basically that what we would now see as plagiarism was common practice throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. As someone does ask, Mel asks, do you need any volunteers to help with the map collection?
Yes, I think so. I've had now that I've been drawing attention to it, there's been a number of people that have been emailing and saying, "How can we help?" So I would, that would be great if you send me if you were able to send me an email. Then I may not respond immediately. I'm kind of collecting together responses, and then hopefully maybe in the new year, we might be able to get something organized.
No, that would be great to get a little cadre of volunteers going. And just as we wrap up, I kind of would like your philosophizing thoughts on what do you really want for this collection within UCL and how it's being used there in terms of classroom use, things like that, but also for map collections like this more broadly.
So I would like the I suppose the big idea for me is for people to appreciate maps on a slightly deeper level than they do, in the way that we celebrate artists who do great portraits, or photographers who do great landscape photography, or even journalism and things like that. So thinking about maps, putting those sorts of lenses on maps, I think reveals so much more about their makers and the impacts they had in the world, but also their intended impact. And so mobilizing these collections to help do that, I think, is an important asset. And what's so fantastic about the remaining university collections is, one, people have kind of forgotten they existed, so that's like a bonus that we have these maps. But two, they are generally more accessible, because they're not considered sort of the only copies necessary of anything. So if I couldn't do this book with the British Library necessarily, because I would be fiddling around too much to see them getting all the maps out and all the rest of it, and photo imaging and stuff. Whereas if I had a group of students coming as the map library, I can just pull out the maps I want straight away. I don't need to
Mhm.
request them and so on. So I'm hoping that, it would be fantastic to get of a consortium of kind of the remaining collections and the residual collections in Bloomsbury together to create, even if it's a virtual collection. I think it would be really brilliant. So um, that's what I guess the kind of ambition is. I think there's a long, we kind of got a long road to get there, and you'll appreciate this more than anyone, that maps are an odd thing, because people are hugely enthusiastic about them, particularly outside of academia. Everyone loves maps, and there's like loads of map stuff happening at the moment. British Library's got a big maps exhibition and stuff like that. Um, but then when it comes to the difficult issues of where do the maps get stored, how do we preserve them, how do we scan them, all that kind of stuff, it then becomes a much more complicated. But hopefully, if we can energize some people around these spaces, I know that Nottingham, for example, University of Nottingham's done a good job with
Mhm.
theirs as well. Then yeah, there's certainly demand for their use, I would say.
There certainly is, and we've seen the enthusiasm for maps in general with the wonderful turnout we've had for this talk today. So we'd really like to thank you for joining us during this UCL lunch hour lecture. Shortly, there's going to be a QR code up on the screen, and that is for a feedback form. So if you could please use that, it takes 2 minutes, it's multiple choice, and it helps the organizers to calibrate and improve this series. So that would be really helpful if you could fill that out. And while you're all doing that, please also consider attending the next lunch hour lecture, which is titled Destitution by Design, Immigration Policy and the Conditions of Life Making. which is actually this Thursday, 13th November, again from 1 to 2 p.m. Thank you again to James for his fascinating research and work, and to all of you for listening. Have a very good afternoon.